Welcome! Today I'm going to discuss the events leading up to and during German occupation of Norway, the deportation of Norwegian Jews and refugees, and the powerful impact of refugee treatment. Despite efforts from the royal family, Norway's reaction to refugees fleeing Nazi Germany led to the deportation and eventual genocide of the populace of Jews in the area, except for those who fled to Sweden. Before we dive into what happened to the Norwegian Jews and Jewish refugees during Nazi Germany's control, we must consider how the country was run and the weakest parts that led to the eventual death of their Jewish people. Håkon VII was the first Norwegian king after the Swedish-Norwegian Union secession in 1905. He ruled in both World War I and World War II. Although Norway remained neutral during World War I, it had multiple ties to Great Britain due to the large imports the country relied on. This is important to note because Håkon and the government fled from Norway to London to lead war efforts there, which we will discuss later. As I stated before, during the 1930s, Norway remained neutral with its trading partners, including Britain and Germany. As you can see on the map, Norway had a unique position north of Germany and northeast of Great Britain, with the North Sea separating the two. Both the British and the Germans planned to invade the country. Germany planned to utilize Narvik, Norway to ensure iron supplies from Sweden, while Britain planned to stop the export. Prime ministers of Britain also noted that bringing Norway into the war would draw German forces there instead of to another front. This British takeover imposed Norway to be part of the Western powers, forcing them to be enemies with Germany. General Nicholas von Falkenhorst recalled a conversation with Hitler in which Hitler predicted that the English would land in Norway. He also remarked that the British occupation of Norway would be a, quote, strategic turning movement because it would lead them into the Baltic in which German troops were not placed. A British invasion would also allow the Brits to easily advance into Berlin. Both Germany and Great Britain saw Norway as a tool to further advance themselves in the war, lacking the consideration for the peoples of the country. To start, very few Norwegian-born Jews nor refugees occupied Norway before nor during World War II. With many conflicting reports, an estimated 1,800 Jews lived in Norway in 1940, 350 of which were refugees from Germany and Austria seeking safety from the Nazis. In comparison, more than 3 million Jews lived in Poland on the eve of the German invasion. Norway enacted multiple refugee immigration policies during the 1930s in hopes of remaining neutral with Germany. This small number of population, however, doesn't mean the Nazi impact was any less significant. Norwegian Jews were stripped from their home country, whether fleeing or forcefully pushed into concentration camps. Many historians, including those working for the National Holocaust Museum, believe that leader Vidkun Quisling had a large responsibility for the genocide of the Norwegian Jews and refugees. During Håkon's reign in the 1930s, Vidkun Quisling was developing into a leader that later became a Nazi collaborator and was eventually charged with treason. Quisling was an extremely intelligent man that achieved the highest scores in War College and record-breaking grades in the military academy. Surprisingly, Quisling spent his time traveling on humanitarian missions. During this time, Quisling had developed his own political philosophy of universalism. In short, this is Christian ideology combined with modern-day physics and science. The philosophy also sought for world unity. While universalism may not sound half bad, it led to a belief in racial superiority, just as fascism did in Italy. Quisling attempted to assert his philosophy into the Norwegian government. With this intention in mind, Quisling served as the Minister of Defense for 3 years in 1931. This was short-lived, however, because he wasn't able to become party leader of the Norwegian government. Thus, Quisling left to found the National Union. While this party was unpopular, the Union collaborated with the Nazis, preaching their ideologies and enforcing their takeover. Quisling saw Jewish hatred as a way to dominate, and therefore he reflected Hitler's actions. This ideology quickly became a part of Quisling's character. In 1938 and 1939, he presented multiple lectures on anti-Semitism to protest Jewish refugees fleeing from Germany being able to enter into Norway. His National Union was still unpopular, and his only option II assumed control was to support Germany. In December 1939, self-proclaimed Prime Minister Quisling met with Hitler, alerting him of the possible British invasion. Then, Hitler called upon Operation Weserberg, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. Despite best efforts from royalty, on April 10, 1940, Operation Weserberg was fast, taking over Norwegian capital Oslo in less than 12 hours. Nazis plundered into Norway, spewing misinformation to German citizens that they were there to safeguard the freedom and security of Norwegians, according to CBS broadcast from Berlin. The Nazis contradicted themselves by bombing and burning the country to flames. Germany was able to make the first ambiguous landing in the country, even though the Royal Army occupied the water in an attempt to destroy iron. They burned and vandalized buildings, dropped bombs, and attacked utilizing naval forces. Major Norwegian ports were occupied by the Germans in a couple of hours, as well as their airfields. Norway relied heavily on British forces, which retreated 25,000 troops in May due to the threats of invading Britain as well. King Haakon refused to surrender to the Germans, even after General von Falkenhorst offered a final appeal of exchange in German rule for protecting the country from the Allies. Haakon responded by releasing multiple statements to Norwegian citizens to do their best to protect their freedom and that France and Britain promised to help aid Norway. He voiced to his citizens that the Nazis had one intention, to, quote, annihilate all of us, quote. Several attempts were made to kill Haakon by dropping bombs on his possible locations. Eventually, the king and the rest of the government had to flee to London. Consequently, with Quisling's encouragement, the Germans occupied Norway, shipping Jews out of the country, mostly to concentration camp Auschwitz. Nazis started the mass genocide of Norwegian Jews and refugees by stripping them of their property and incarcerating innocent people. Nazis, Quisling's National Union Party, and the Norwegian state police forces started to enforce Nuremberg laws. First, they passed laws in which Jews had to give up their radios, and then in October 1941, they were required to give up all their property, including businesses. The Norwegian government in exile in London attempted to counteract the Nazis' treatment by passing the decree concerning the invalidity of legal transactions connected with the occupation to guarantee restoration of property. While the act didn't work during the war, it had some great effect for survivors and families to receive their items after the war. That following January, Jews were required to have a giant J stamped on their paperwork. Then, the mass incarceration of men began, followed by women and children. November 1942, the Jews were sent out of Norway on the ship Danu, which is pictured on the right. A New York Times newspaper issued in 1942 with the heading, 1,000 Jews sent out of Norway by Nazis, placed on freighter bound for undisclosed port. This article mentions that the Jews were packed onto a 9,000-ton freighter to an unknown location. The rumor is that they were either headed for Poland or German-occupied areas in the Soviet Union. It states that the people were deported using Quisling's stormtroopers and that another deportation is expected to come. As predicted, in February, 795 Jews were sent out of the country to concentration camp Auschwitz. The photo on the top left is one of the forms of protest Norwegian citizens created during the war. The image is a sign of Norwegian unity, while the photo on the top right is an image of a vandalized Jewish-owned store, most likely committed by the Nazis or Quisling stormtroopers. Concentration camp Auschwitz. 759 Norwegian Jews and refugees were deported to Auschwitz. Only 25 survived. Auschwitz is the largest Nazi concentration camp, taking the lives of an estimated 1.1 million people. Life in the camp consisted of filthy conditions and brutal labor. This camp was designed with one purpose in mind: kill all Jews. Whether they died by gas chambers, starvation, or beatings, Hitler's agenda was satisfied. Victim Kitty Hart Moxon shared her survival story in the documentary One Day in Auschwitz with teenage girls, describing to them the gruesome life that she faced in camp. I highly suggest everyone to watch this documentary to fully grasp what the Jewish people, including majority of the Norwegian refugees, went through. Many of the Norwegian refugees were lucky enough to flee to Sweden. Throughout the war, Sweden was able to remain neutral, yet biased to protect the Jewish population. After securing safety for their people, Gothenburg University students demanded that Sweden admit refugees freely, specifically focusing on Denmark, Finland, and Norway. A survey was done indicating that the deportation of Jews from Norway made the strongest impact on Swedish citizens in 1942. Around 900 Jews escaped to Sweden, crossing very difficult terrain with the help of other Norwegian citizens in the resistance. Finding refuge in another country was much easier for Norwegian Jews than others because of the small population and help from others. A Norwegian Jew, Irene Berman, was one of the many who fled to Sweden after German occupation in 1940. Her father, Marcus, worked for Jewish Relief in Norway and then Stockholm Jewish Community to locate missing people in Sweden. He was a major asset in helping people to survive the escape. However, he lost his sister and nephews to the deportation. Just as many Americans here today with the Mexican border crisis, accidents happen. On October 22, 1942, a Border Patrol guard was killed by a border guide with the help of propaganda. The Jews were portrayed as the murderers. Quisling and other National Union leaders were heavily in charge of the media and used propaganda to shift citizens' opinions. However, many citizens were disobedient to the Nazi reign, giving the speechless Jews a voice. On another note, around 50,000 non-Jewish peoples fled to Sweden as well to seek safety. Due to the war efforts by Håkon and Norwegian Parliament, many of the refugees were able to keep all their movable property and eventually have their belongings returned to them post-war. Some Swedish Jews rejected the idea of other Jewish people fleeing to Sweden because they didn't want the Nazis to come after their asylum. Sweden was never invaded nor occupied and remained a safe haven for Jewish people. Majority of the refugees that fled to Sweden survived, unlike their fellow Jewish neighbors that were deported and killed. The government in exile, including Håkon VII, joined the Allies and helped to direct the military throughout the war. On May 8, 1945, the Germans and Norwegian Nazis surrendered and were arrested. The mass arrest of party members was called the Legal Purge. Most notably, Vidkun Quisling was charged with embezzlement, high treason, and murder, with the strongest part of the case being that he allowed the deportation of Jews, which led to their genocide. Quisling insisted that he had no knowledge of their deportation until the Jews were gone, and he was not given any information of what happened to them in Auschwitz. He also blamed the arrest of the Jewish people and refugees on the late state police chief and Minister of Police Jonas Lai. The court concluded that Quisling wasn't aware of the danger that the Jews faced when being deported, and therefore he was only convicted of manslaughter. Quisling was also convicted of treason and sentenced to death. On October 24, 1945, Quisling was put to death by firing squad. While his death doesn't provide enough justice for the thousands of lives lost, it hopefully provided some peace to survivors. Now that I've discussed Norway's treatment to their homeland Jews and refugees fleeing from Central Europe, I'd like to discuss what we need to take away from this. It is important to note that it is never too late to apologize. The Prime Minister, Jens Stockholm of Norway, recently apologized in 2012 to the Jewish people of what occurred on April 10, 1940. On a good note, there are many Jewish organizations forming in Norway. These organizations celebrate Jewish gatherings such as Rosh Hashanah. I would also like to say that as a society, we need to be aware of snakes in the grass forming in politics, just like Quisling. It is important to research our own news and develop our own ideas instead of falling for propaganda that will rot your brain. Lastly, we need to recall what happened and what is still happening to Jewish people to this day. With the Israel and Palestinian conflict, anti-Semitism is on the rise. It is also on the rise in Scandinavia. We need to accept and appreciate everyone's cultural differences and devote our lives to protecting people. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have learned something important today about Norway's treatment to Jewish refugees.